I was the captain of a ship that could not sink. Now I navigate seas that do not exist, and I can no longer remember what land felt like beneath my feet. What is a sailor who has forgotten the meaning of harbor? The first time I noticed the corruption, it was in the chronometer. I had been tracking our position relative to the Mandeville point for what my instruments insisted was 6 hours, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds. The numerals on the brass face were precise. The ticking was metronomic, but when I closed my eyes and counted the intervals between heartbeats, between breaths, between the distant groans of the ship's hull, I arrived at a different number entirely. 14 hours, or perhaps 3. The discrepancy existed, documented, irrefutable. I noted it in the log with the same detached precision I had once reserved for recording stellar drift. Temporal perception variance, subjective duration exceeds objective measurement by factor unknown. Hypothesis, warp exposure. Recommendation, monitor crew for similar symptoms. I did not yet understand that the corruption was not in the chronometer. My name was Hendrick van der Decken. I had commanded the Geestelijke Vrijheid, the spiritual liberty, a pretentious name chosen by the Ecclesiarchy administrators who commissioned her, for 163 standard years. By the Imperium's reckoning, I was 209 years old, my life extended by Juvenat treatments, and a genetic compatibility with rejuvenat procedures that the Mechanicus considered statistically improbable. By my own reckoning, I had been a void captain since I was old enough to understand that the emptiness between stars was the only honest place in the galaxy. Everything else was theater. Space, at least, did not pretend to be anything other than what it was: vast, indifferent, and waiting. I loved it with the kind of love that requires no reciprocation. The Geestelijke Vrijheid was a dictator-class cruiser, 12 kilometers of armored fury and devotional architecture, her prow shaped like a cathedral spire aimed at the throat of the void. I knew every rivet of her. I could walk her corridors in total darkness and never once touch a wall. I had overseen 7 major refits, argued with 3 generations of tech, priests about the proper veneration of her plasma drives, and personally led boarding actions against orc raiders, chaos renegades, and one particularly stubborn pirate fleet that had made the mistake of thinking an ecclesiarchy vessel would hesitate before opening fire. We did not hesitate. We never hesitated. That was the ship I had been. The mission that changed everything, that initiated the long, terrible process I am now documenting, was unremarkable in its parameters. The ecclesiarchy required the transport of a cardinal, legate and his retinue from the shrine world of Ophelia Vitu to the fortress cathedral on Dimmermar, a journey of approximately 6,000 light years through relatively stable warp currents. Standard duration 42 days. Acceptable risk factor negligible. I had made similar runs 417 times across my career. I calculated the route myself, as I always did. I did not trust navigator houses entirely. Their gene-bred third eyes saw truths, yes, but truths filtered through mutations that brought them too close to the warp's unreality. I preferred mathematics, predictable stellar positions, known current flows. I plotted a course that would take us through 3 translation points, each carefully chosen to minimize our exposure to the deeper tides. The navigator, a woman named Yevgena of House Belisarius, reviewed my calculations with what I interpreted as professional respect. Conservative, she said, but sound. We will arrive precisely on schedule, Captain. I remember feeling satisfaction at that assessment. I remember it the way one remembers facts from a book read long ago, intellectually, without emotional residue. We translated into the warp on schedule. The Jella field engaged at 99.3% efficiency. The ship's choir, 300 psychers bound in psychic chains and force, fed blessed oils to keep their minds from fragmenting, began their harmonic stabilization chants. I stood on the command throne and watched the real space viewport shutters slam closed, sealing us away from a universe governed by physics. The warp sight portals activated, and through them I saw what I had seen hundreds of times before: the roiling, impossible colors of the immaterium, a sea that was not water, a sky that was not sky, currents of raw emotion and psychic screaming given the appearance of substance. I felt nothing. That should have been the first warning. Not the absence of fear, I had long since mastered fear, but the absence of awe. The warp was terrible, yes, but it was also magnificent in its wrongness, a testament to realities that existed beyond human comprehension. I had always felt something when entering it, a tightening in my chest, a quickening of my pulse, the primal acknowledgement that I was transgressing against the natural order. This time nothing. Clinical observation only. I noted the Geller field's energy consumption, 743 megawatts. I noted the choir's neural output stable at 1100 psychic units. I noted my own heart rate, 58 beats per minute, unchanged from baseline. Captain, Yevgena's voice crackled through the Vox, transmitted from the navigator's blister at the ship's prow. We are 3 hours into the translation. Currents are calm. I am adjusting our heading by 0.03 degrees to account for a minor eddy. We remain on schedule. Acknowledged, I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as though someone else was speaking through my throat. The journey should have taken 42 days. It took longer, or perhaps shorter. The chronometers disagreed with themselves. The ship's clocks ran at different speeds in different sections. The engineering deck's time flowed faster than the chapel's, which flowed slower than the crew quarters, which seemed to stop entirely in the sections we had sealed off after the third incident. No, the third was later. The second. The incident that I should describe but find I cannot precisely locate in the sequence of events, because sequence implies causality and causality implies time, and time had become a hypothesis I could no longer verify. I began documenting the discrepancies. It was what I did, what I had always done. Data provided clarity. I installed additional chronometers in key locations and had servitors record their readings hourly. The results were impossible. In the span of what the main bridge chronometer claimed was 1 standard day, the starboard gunnery deck's clock recorded 4 days. The port gunnery deck's clock recorded 18 hours. The Medica Bay's chronometer ran backward for 6 minutes, then forward at triple speed, then stopped entirely for a period that I measured by counting my own heartbeats, 5,312 of them, before resuming its normal function. I presented these findings to Yevgena. She studied the data with her third eye covered, a breach of protocol that I noted but did not comment upon. The warp is turbulent, she said finally, more turbulent than the auguries suggested. Time flows differently here. You know this, Captain. I know that time should flow consistently across a single vessel, I replied. The Geller field maintains a bubble of real space physics. That is its function. The Geller field maintains a barrier against daimonic incursion, she corrected. It does not guarantee temporal stability. That is, beyond its design parameters. Then what is causing this? She looked at me with her normal eyes, both of them a pale, washed-out blue that reminded me of ice, and I saw something in them that I had not expected. Pity. Captain, she said, how long do you believe we have been in the warp? I consulted the main bridge chronometer. 15 days, 7 hours, 21 minutes. And by your subjective experience, I opened my mouth to answer and realized I did not know. I tried to count backward through the days. I could remember entering the warp. I could remember this conversation, happening now. But the space between was a blur of routines and observations and watches that I had completed with mechanical precision while feeling absolutely nothing. I don't know, I said. Yevgena's expression did not change, but I saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the data slate. We have been in the warp for 72 days, Captain. By every one of my instruments. By the choir's exhaustion, by the wear on the Geller field generators. 72 days. I should have felt shock. Alarm. Something. That is impossible, I said and meant it as a technical assessment, not an emotional response. Yes, Yevgena agreed. It is. The crew began to change before I did, or perhaps I changed first and simply did not notice. Too focused on my instruments and calculations to observe the decay spreading through my own ship like rust through iron. Chief Engineer Kurtz was the first casualty I documented. I found him in the plasma drive chamber, standing before the reactor's containment field, with his hands pressed against the energy barrier. The field was operating at standard parameters. Temperature 12,000 degrees Kelvin, radiation output sufficient to kill an unshielded human in 3.7 seconds. Kurtz's hands were unshielded. The flesh was blackened, crisp, the bone visible beneath. He did not scream. "Engineer," I said, my voice sharp with command authority. "Step away from the containment field." He turned to look at me. His face was calm. "Captain," he said, "I have been trying to feel it for 6 hours." "Feel what?" "Heat. Pain. Anything." He looked down at his ruined hands with what I can only describe as clinical interest. "The nerves are transmitting signals. My augmetic pain receptors are registering tissue damage. But I am receiving the information as data, not sensation. Do you understand the difference?" I did. "Emperor, help me." I understood perfectly. "You are relieved of duty," I said. "Report to the medici immediately." "To what purpose?" He tilted his head, the gesture eerily similar to how a servitor might respond to a query outside its programming. "They will repair the tissue. The sensation will not return. I have reviewed the medical literature, Captain. This is not a neurological disorder. This is something else." "What is it then?" He smiled, and it was the most terrible expression I had ever seen on a human face, because it was not terrible at all. It was empty. "I believe," he said, "that I am forgetting how to be human. And I believe you are too." I had him sedated and placed in isolation. The medici's report confirmed massive tissue damage, but no infection, no signs of pain response despite the severity of the injury. Kurtz's neural scans showed normal activity. He was, by every medical standard, perfectly healthy, except that he could no longer feel anything at all. I noted it in the log. Suspected warp exposure effect. Recommend monitoring crew for similar symptoms. I did not write what I was truly thinking, that I had stood in that plasma chamber and watched a man burn his hands to bone, and I had felt nothing either. Not horror, not compassion, just the cool, distant interest of someone observing a particularly intriguing malfunction. The second incident involved Sister Margaret, one of the Ecclesiarchy's battle sisters assigned to protect the Cardinal Legate. I encountered her in the ship's main chapel, a vast space of vaulted ceilings and stained glass, depicting the Emperor's ascension. She was kneeling before the primary altar, her bolter laid carefully to one side, her power armor's servos whining softly as she held herself perfectly still. "Sister," I said. She did not respond. I approached closer. The chapel's incense, a specific blend called sanctified tears, containing 0.7 milligrams of Kellyan root per gram, designed to induce visions of the Emperor's light, hung heavy in the air. I had smelled it 1,000 times. I knew its effect, a gentle euphoria, a sense of connection to the divine. I breathed it in and catalogued its chemical components. I felt nothing. "Sister Margaret," I said again, louder. This time she turned. Her face, normally stern with the fierce devotion of the Order's militant, was slack, not peaceful. Peace implies contentment. This was absence. "Captain," she said, "I have been praying for 11 hours, and the Emperor does not answer." "The Emperor's will is not always. You misunderstand," she interrupted, her voice perfectly level. "I do not mean that my prayers are unanswered. I mean that I am speaking the words, and I feel nothing. No faith, no hope, no connection. I am reciting syllables that I have known since childhood, and they are just sounds. Tell me, Captain, when does devotion become merely habit? When does a prayer become a recording?" I had no answer for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed too clear, too focused, as though she was seeing through me to something beyond. "You feel it too," she said. It was not a question. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. We are all feeling it. Or rather, we are all not feeling it. The absence. The hollowing. Like something is eating us from the inside out, and what it's consuming is not our flesh but our ability to care that it's happening. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to summon outrage, or concern, or even simple annoyance at a subordinate speaking so directly to a superior officer. But I could not find those emotions. They existed somewhere in my memory, templates of responses I had executed thousands of times, but the actual feeling, the heat, the urgency, the weight of human passion was gone. "Report to your commander," I said. "You are unfit for duty," she laughed. It was a small sound, bitter and knowing. "We are all unfit, Captain. We just have not admitted it yet." I left her there, kneeling in the incense-thick air, and made my way back to the bridge. The ship felt different, quieter. Not in terms of sound. The engines still rumbled, the air recyclers still hummed, the crew still went about their duties, but in some essential quality I could not name. It was as though the Geestelijke Vrijheid herself was holding her breath, waiting for something to happen or to finish happening. I consulted the chronometers. They disagreed. The main bridge clock read 90, 4 days since translation. The navigator's chronometer read 108. My personal timepiece, a gift from my predecessor captain, read 37. I no longer knew which one was correct. I no longer knew if correct was a meaningful concept. I began to research. This was what I did when confronted with problems I could not solve through command authority or firepower. I investigated. I dug through data. I read reports. I analyzed patterns. The Geestelijke Vrijheid carried extensive archives, 14,000 years of Imperial naval history, medical records, psychostudies, and warp phenomenon documentation. I locked myself in my quarters and began to read. The first relevant case I found was the Eternal Martyr, a Cardinal-class cruiser that had translated into the warp 1700 years ago and emerged 6 months later with its entire crew dead. Not killed dead. They had simply stopped. Seized all functions. The ship itself was undamaged. The Jello field had remained active. The supplies were intact. But every single human being aboard, from the captain to the lowliest deck scrubber, had died sitting at their stations, lying in their bunks, standing in the corridors. The autopsies found nothing, no disease, no trauma, no biological explanation. The official report listed the cause as warp exposure, indeterminate mechanism. Unofficially, one of the investigating medica had written a note in the margins. They forgot how to live. I read that line 17 times, counting each repetition, and felt a terrible recognition settle in my chest like cold iron. The second case was the Pilgrim's Resolve, a transport vessel that had spent 300 days in the warp, far longer than any safe journey, and emerged with its crew still alive, but fundamentally changed. They performed their duties with mechanical precision. They responded to orders. They maintained the ship, but they did not speak except when spoken to. They did not sleep except on schedule. They did not eat except when nutrition was required. One observer described them as flawlessly efficient and utterly hollow, like servitors who remember being human but can no longer quite manage it. The crew of the Pilgrim's Resolve had been studied extensively. Medical scans showed normal brain activity. Genetic testing revealed no mutations. Psychers examined them and found no demonic taint, no warp corruption, no external influence whatsoever. The conclusion of the lead researcher, a Magos biologist named Vector 7, was documented in clinical language that I found myself reading aloud to the empty air of my quarters. Hypothesis: extended exposure to the immaterium results not in corruption, but in dissolution. The human psyche, evolved in a universe of fixed physical laws and linear causality, cannot maintain coherent self-concept when subjected to extended immersion in a realm where such laws do not apply. The result is not madness. Madness requires sufficient self-awareness to recognize deviation from normalcy, but rather a gradual erosion of the emotional and cognitive structures that define individual identity. The subject continues to function, continues to think, continues to exist, but the essential quality of their as being, the subjective experience of selfhood, is progressively attenuated until only the mechanical processes remain. In colloquial terms, the soul is not stolen or corrupted. It simply forgets itself. I read that passage 43 times. I counted. I began testing myself. I obtained a standard Imperial pain stimulus device, a simple instrument designed to deliver controlled electrical shocks for disciplinary or medical purposes, and applied it to my left arm. Low setting first 5 milliamps, enough to produce a sharp, stinging sensation. I noted the neural response muscles contracted, heart rate elevated by 3 beats per minute, pupils dilated 0.04 millimeters. But the sensation itself, the quality of pain, the immediate visceral wrongness that should accompany nerve stimulation, was absent. I was observing my body's mechanical response to stimulus. I was not experiencing pain. I increased the setting, 10 milliamps, 15, 20. The muscle contractions became more pronounced. I could smell my own flesh burning where the contacts pressed against skin. I watched with detached interest as my arm spasmed, as the tissue blackened, as the instrument's safety limiter finally engaged and shut down the current. I felt nothing. I sat in my quarters, my arm ruined, and tried to remember what pain felt like. I could recall the memory of it. The time I had broken my ribs during a boarding action, the time I had caught my hand in a bulkhead door, the time I had been burned by plasma backwash. I could remember that I had experienced pain, but I could not access the sensation itself. It was like trying to remember a color you had only seen once as a child. You knew it existed, but the actual experience was lost. I went to the medica. They treated the burns with the same mechanical efficiency that was now characteristic of the entire crew. No one asked how I had been injured. No one expressed concern. We were all going through the motions of humanity while the substance of it leaked away. I returned to the archives. The cases I found all followed similar patterns. Crews exposed to extended warp travel exhibited progressive loss of emotional response, diminished pain sensation, decreased survival instinct, and eventual cessation of all non-essential activities. The timeline varied. Some deteriorated over months, others over years. But the end state was always the same, functioning but hollow shells, human in shape, but absent the quality that made humanity worth preserving. There were theories. The Inquisition had investigated several cases and concluded that extended warp exposure might partially phase human consciousness into the immaterium, creating beings that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. The Mechanicus had proposed that the human neural pattern, when subjected to non-Euclidean geometries and acausal timestreams, underwent a form of catastrophic decoherence, losing the quantum entanglements that somehow generated subjective experience. The ecclesiarchy simply called it the forgetting and added it to their litany of reasons why humanity should not travel the warp without proper faith and devotion. None of the theories offered a cure. None of the documented cases showed recovery. Once the forgetting began, it progressed inevitably to completion. I was in Act 3 of my own dissolution, and I knew it. We were still in the warp. I knew this because the warp sight portals showed the roiling impossible colors. I knew this because the Geller field generators were still drawing power. I knew this because we had not translated back to real space. But I no longer knew for how long. The chronometers had given up any pretense of agreement. Some ran forward, some ran backward. Some displayed times that could not exist, negative numbers, dates from before the Imperium's founding, counts that exceeded the number of seconds since the universe's birth. I had stopped checking them. They were providing data, yes, but data without context is merely noise. I asked Yevgana how long we had been traveling. She was in the navigator's blister, her third eye exposed, and weeping fluid that should have been clear, but was instead the color of tarnished silver. "Captain," she said, "I have been navigating for 163 days. Or perhaps 2 hours. Or perhaps we never entered the warp at all, and this is still the moment of translation, stretched infinitely thin. I can no longer distinguish. We need to translate back to real space," I said. "To where?" she asked. "I have lost our position. The constellations do not match. The currents do not correspond to any charts. I believe we are still in the warp. I believe we are still moving. But I cannot tell you toward what destination, or if destination is a concept that still applies to us. Then choose a direction and translate. Any direction. Anywhere is better than here. Is it?" She looked at me with all 3 eyes, and I saw that they were all weeping now, all leaking that tarnished silver fluid. "What do you think we will find in real space, Captain? Do you think we will emerge unchanged? Do you think the universe out there still contains the things we remember, duty, purpose, home? Or do you think we have been gone so long that we have become something else, something that no longer fits in the world we left behind?" I had no answer. "I will try," she said finally. "I will calculate a translation point. But Captain, I do not know if we will like what we find." She began her preparations. I returned to the bridge. The crew were at their stations. They moved with precision. They responded to commands. They maintained perfect efficiency. And they were all dead, not physically. Their hearts beat, their lungs processed air, their brains fired electrical impulses. But the spark, the ineffable quality that separated a human from a servitor, was gone. I looked at them and saw myself reflected back, empty automatons performing programmed routines, while the universe ground on, indifferent to our absence. I thought about the Flying Dutchman. I had read the old myth once, in a dusty archive of pre-Imperial folklore. A captain, cursed to sail forever, unable to make port, doomed to endless voyage through waters that would never lead home. At the time, I had dismissed it as primitive superstition, the kind of stories sailors told themselves to make sense of dangers they could not understand. Now I wondered if the story had been true. If somewhere, somewhen, there had been a ship that had sailed too long in waters, that operated by rules other than those of the natural world. A ship that had crossed over from being a vessel, commanded by men, into being something else. Something that existed in the space between worlds, crewed by things that remembered being human, but could no longer quite manage it. Were we that ship now? Had the Geestelijke Vrijheid become the thing we had once feared in stories? I stood at my command throne and looked out at the warp sight portals. The colors moved in patterns that hurt to observe, not physically, because I could no longer feel pain, but in some deeper way that suggested my consciousness was still trying to process impossibilities and failing. I saw faces in the colors, ships, worlds, futures that might have been, pasts that never were, and threading through it all, a sense of vast, terrible amusement, as though something out there was watching us and laughing at the exquisite joke of our predicament. We had entered the warp to cross from one point to another. But the warp does not operate on the principle of points and lines. It operates on emotion, on meaning, on the weight of stories and symbols, and the accumulated psychic residue of billions of minds screaming their fears and hopes into the void. And we had become a story. The ship that could not return. The crew that had forgotten how to be human. The eternal voyage with no destination. The warp had recognized us and claimed us, not through corruption but through pure narrative weight. We were no longer a ship traveling through the warp. We were a warp story given form and set loose to sail forever. Captain, Yevgena's voice crackled over the vox. I have calculated a translation point. Recommend immediate emergence. Coordinates. Unknown. Captain, I do not know where we will emerge. I am simply pointing us at the brightest constellation I can perceive and hoping it corresponds to something in real space. Execute translation, I ordered. The ship shuddered. The Jella field generators screamed. The choir, those that were still conscious, began their reality anchor chants, their voices thin and ragged with exhaustion. We translated. I expected stars. I expected the cold, honest void of real space, with its predictable physics and its indifferent beauty. What I saw through the forward viewports was the Geestelijke Vrijheid herself. She hung in the distance, perhaps 100,000 kilometers away. Her cathedral prow pointed directly at us. Every detail was perfect, the Gothic architecture of her superstructure, the weapon batteries along her flanks, the observation blisters and sensor arrays. I could even see the damage marker on her port side, a scar from an orc attack 7 years ago that we had never quite gotten around to repairing. Captain, the sensor officer reported, his voice flat and empty. We are detecting a vessel at coordinates 037 by 12. Configuration matches our own. Transponder signal matches our own. Life signs match our own crew complement. Scan for warp signatures, I said. No warp presence detected. We are in real space. All physics readings normal. But Captain, the vessel is broadcasting on our command frequency. Put it through. The vox crackled. My own voice came through the speakers. This is Captain Hendrick van der Decken of the Geestelijke Vrijheid. Unknown vessel. You are in violation of Imperial space. Identify yourself immediately or be fired upon. I looked at the other ship, at myself, and understood. We had not translated back to real space. Or rather, we had translated to a real space, but not the one we had left. The warp had spun us out into a pocket of reality that existed alongside our own universe, a shadow realm where all possibilities collapsed into a single, eternal moment. The moment of sailing forever, with no beginning and no end. There were hundreds of versions of the Geestelijke Vrijheid out there. I could see them now, emerging from the stellar background like ghosts becoming solid. Each one identical. Each one broadcasting the same warning. Each one crewed by the same empty shells that had once been human. We were the Flying Dutchman, all of us, every version. Sailing forever through the cracks between realities, cursed not by some angry god, but by the simple mathematics of warp exposure and time dilation, and the gradual dissolution of everything that made us capable of caring about escape. Captain, Yevgena said over the vox. We can translate again. I can try different coordinates. We can keep searching for the right real space, the one where we belong. And how long will that take? Silence. How long have we already been searching? I asked. More silence, stretching into something that was no longer time but simple absence. I don't remember, Yevgenia said finally. Neither did I. I looked at my crew. They looked at me. We were all the same, empty things pretending to be human, going through the motions because we had forgotten that there was supposed to be a reason to stop. Navigator, I said, continue translation attempts. Plot a new course every 6 hours, log each emergence, we will keep searching. For what, Captain? For home, I said, and the word felt like ash in my mouth. But we would search. We would translate and emerge and find ourselves again and again, an infinite series of echoes trying to remember what we had once been. Because that was all we had left, the routine, the duty, the mechanical execution of a purpose that no longer carried meaning. We were sailors who had forgotten what harbor felt like, and we would sail forever. Time lost its coherence entirely after that. I stopped trying to count the translations. They blurred together, moments of warp sight, moments of real space, moments of finding ourselves or finding nothing, or finding things that should not exist. We encountered other ships sometimes, Imperial vessels, mostly following their normal routes through the cosmos. We tried to hail them. Our Vox signals never reached them. We tried to approach. They never seemed to see us. We existed in their universe but not of it, like light that could pass through without interacting. Once we found holy terror itself. I stood on the command bridge and looked at humanity's birthworld through the forward viewport. I could see the hives stacked upon themselves like artificial mountains. I could see the orbital rings where the Adeptus Terra maintained their administrative centers. I could see the lights of billions of souls, all of them living and dying in service to the Emperor. We were close enough that I could have targeted specific structures with our weapons. Close enough that our sensors could pick up individual Vox transmissions. Close enough to hear the prayers of the faithful, broadcast from 10,000 churches, all of them begging for salvation or strength or simple survival. I felt nothing. Terra was the heart of the Imperium, the most holy place in human space. Every ship captain dreamed of seeing it once before death. I had made pilgrimage 3 times in my long career, and each time I had wept at the sight of it, wept with joy and terror and overwhelming gratitude that I lived in a universe where such a thing existed. Now I looked at it and catalogued data. Population density, approximately 900 billion. Orbital altitude 36,000 kilometers. Strategic value incalculable. Emotional response null. Captain, someone said, I no longer tracked which crew member was speaking. They were all the same voice. Shall we attempt to make contact? No, I said. We are not here. Not really. We are nowhere. We translated away. The pattern repeated. Emerge, observe. Find ourselves disconnected from whatever reality we had entered. Translate again. The ship held together through it all. The Mechanicus would have been horrified at how far past safe operational parameters we had pushed the Gela generators, but the machine spirits seemed content to keep functioning. Or perhaps they, too, had forgotten how to die. The crew went through their routines. I went through mine. We maintained the ship. We stood watches. We performed the rituals of human routine while the universe slipped past us like water past a stone. I no longer knew if we were looking for escape or simply executing an eternal program. The same way a servitor continues to sweep long after the room is clean, too. The first Imperial ship we destroyed came upon us by accident. We had emerged in what appeared to be stable real space, coordinates unknown, stellar configurations unrecognizable. The Geestelijke Vrijheid hung in the void like a ghost, all systems operational, all crew at stations waiting for something. Anything. The next translation. The next meaningless jump to the next meaningless location. Then the sensors detected another vessel. She was a light cruiser, perhaps 4 kilometers long, her design consistent with Imperial naval architecture from approximately M37. Old then but well maintained. Her name was the Morning Star. I knew this because her transponder was broadcasting openly. No attempt at stealth or deception. She was simply traveling, following her designated route through the void, utterly unaware that she was about to encounter something that should not exist. Captain, the sensor officer reported, Vessel approaching at heading 090, Imperial configuration. Shall we hail? Yes. We sent the standard greeting protocols. The Morning Star did not respond. We sent again. Still nothing. We sent a third time, on every frequency we could access. The other ship continued on her course, unaware or uncaring of our presence. Captain, the Vox officer said, they cannot hear us. Or they are choosing not to respond. Bring us alongside, I ordered. Close to visual range, the Geestelijke Vrijheid had moved, her engines firing with smooth precision. We came within 1,000 kilometers of the Morning Star. Close enough to see details through the augmented viewing ports, the weapon batteries, the observation blisters, the small figures of crew members visible through illuminated viewports. They did not see us. I watched a man walk past one of the Morning Star's viewports, carrying a data slate, moving with the purposeful stride of someone with duties to fulfill. He did not look up, did not glance at the massive cathedral, ship hovering in his field of view. We were invisible to him. We are not translating properly, Yevgenia said over the Vox. She sounded tired, not the physical exhaustion of overwork, but something deeper. The weariness of existing without purpose. We are here, but we are also still in the warp. Partially. We exist in both states simultaneously. Real space can see our physical presence, but cannot interact with it. We are ghosts, Captain. Literal ghosts. Can we force interaction? I asked. I do not know. Why would you want to? That was a good question. Why did I want to? The Morning Star posed no threat. Her crew were going about their lives, serving the Emperor, fulfilling their duties. What purpose would interaction serve? But I found myself ordering it anyway. Because some deep, atrophied part of me remembered that ships were supposed to see each other. That humans were supposed to communicate. That connection was supposed to matter, even if I could no longer remember why. Weapons, I said. Target the Morning Star's engines. Minimum power. I want to get their attention, not destroy them. Captain. The lance batteries fired. Beams of coherent light crossed the void and struck the Morning Star's aft section. I saw the impacts, the brief flare of energy shields absorbing the blast, the scatter of metal particles as armor plating vaporized. The Morning Star's shields held, but now her crew knew something had attacked them. I watched her weapon batteries swivel toward us. I watched her engines flare as she changed course, orienting to face the threat. I watched her launch proximity scanning pulses, trying to locate her attacker. The pulses passed through us without registering. We were there. We had fired on them. We had caused damage. But we did not exist in a form their sensors could detect. This Morning Star's captain, I wondered if they felt what I had once felt, the weight of command. The pride of duty made what I would have made in their position. Unable to locate the attacker, unable to determine the threat level, they initiated emergency warp translation. I watched them tear a hole in reality and dive through it, escaping into the immaterium to flee a danger they could not see. Captain, Yevgenia said quietly, what have we become? I did not answer, because I did not know. Or rather, I knew but could not accept the knowledge. We were not a ship anymore. We were a phenomenon. A warp thing given the shape of a ship, crewed by warp things given the shape of humans. We were the ghost story that other ships would tell. The unexplained attack. The phantom vessel. The Flying Dutchman, sailing forever, leaving destruction in our wake not from malice but from simple existence. We translated again, following our endless program of searching for a home we would never find. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined other Imperial ships encountering us. Firing on shadows. Fleeing from nothing. Reporting attacks from vessels that did not exist. We were becoming legend. The kind of story sailors told to explain the unexplainable. And we would sail forever, spreading that story, because we had forgotten how to do anything else. I began to compile a record. Not a ship's log that pretended to objectivity, to official documentation. This was something else. A testimony. A confession. An autopsy report written by the corpse about its own death. I spoke into the Vox recorders, narrating my observations, trying to capture the sensation of losing sensation. It was paradoxical work, using language to describe the dissolution of the structures that made language meaningful, but I persisted, because it was all I had left. The clinical observation, the documentation of decay. I described the chronometer discrepancies. I described the crew's progressive hollowing. I described the moment I realized I could no longer remember what emotions felt like, not the fact of having experienced them, but the actual qualitative character of fear or joy or anger or love. I described the ships we encountered and sometimes destroyed, not from hostility, but from simple presence, like a disease spreading through contact. I described the pattern we were following, the endless cycle of translation and emergence and finding ourselves displaced, disconnected, slowly eroding into pure symbol. And I described the question that haunted me, the one I could not answer despite applying all my analytical capacity to it. What were we for? A ship has a purpose. It transports cargo, or people, or weapons. It serves the Imperium. It fights for the Emperor. Even damnation has purpose. Chaos ships serve their dark masters, pursuing goals of corruption and conquest. But we served nothing. We fought no one. We transported nothing. We simply existed, a ship-shaped absence moving through the cosmos, spreading our condition like a virus while pursuing a destination we would never reach. We were sailors who had forgotten what harbor felt like. And we would sail forever. The testimony I recorded would never be heard, of course. We existed outside normal causality. Our Vox signals reached no one. Our presence registered nowhere except in the brief, terrified reports of crews we attacked by accident, crews who could not explain what had happened to them. But I recorded it anyway, because documentation was what I had always done. Because the clinical observation of decay was the only thing I still knew how to perform with precision. Because I hoped, with whatever fragment of hope I retained, buried deep beneath the layers of nothingness, that someday someone would find this record and understand what we had become. Not for their sake. They would be fine without the knowledge. For ours, so that somewhere, in some form, the fact of our existence would be preserved, so that we would not have faded completely from meaning. I was a captain who could no longer remember what command felt like. I was a sailor who had forgotten the meaning of harbor. And I was documenting my own oblivion with the last tools I had: words, and the mechanical precision of a mind that could no longer feel but could still think, could still observe, could still bear witness to its own dissolution. 2. The ship I found in the silent sector was myself. Not another version of the Geestelijke Vrijheid. I had seen hundreds of those by now, scattered across pocket realities like reflections in broken mirrors. This was different. This was the ship I had been before the forgetting began. I knew because she still had a crew that moved with purpose. I knew because her Vox transmissions carried emotional weight, fear, determination, camaraderie. I knew because when I looked at her, I felt something that might have been recognition, or might have been the ghost of recognition, the memory of having once been capable of that emotion. We emerged from the warp into a region of space that registered as stable but empty. No stars visible in any direction, no stellar background, just void, extending infinitely in all directions, broken only by the presence of two ships, my current self and my former self. Captain, the sensor officer reported, vessel detected at close range, Imperial configuration. Transponder identifies her as this Geestelijke Vrijheid, commanded by Captain Hendrick van der Decken. That is impossible, I said. Confirmed, Captain. Detailed scans show perfect match to our own configuration. Crew complement identical. Even minor damage patterns match. Captain, it is us. I activated the forward viewing port and looked at the other ship. She was pristine. No wear from endless warp translations. No signs of the decay that had consumed us. She hung in the void like a promise of what we had once been. Hail them, I ordered. Captain? The Vox officer opened a channel. We waited. The response came immediately, and it was my own voice, but different, younger, firmer, still certain of its authority and purpose. Unknown vessel, this is Captain van der Decken of the Geestelijke Vrijheid. You are broadcasting on Imperial frequencies without proper authorization. Identify yourself immediately. I looked at my crew. They looked back at me with empty eyes. We were being challenged by ourselves, asked to prove our identity to the version of us that still knew what identity meant. This is Captain Hendrick van der Decken, I said into the Vox. Of the Dictator class cruiser Geestelijke Vrijheid. We are. I am. I do not know how to explain what we are. Silence on the other end. Then, your voice pattern matches mine, but that is impossible. I am van der Decken. I am here now, executing my duties. You cannot be me. How long have you been in the warp? I asked. 15 days. We are en route from Ophelia View to Dimamar, a routine transport mission. Why do you ask? 15 days, the same duration I had believed we had traveled once, before the chronometers began to disagree and time lost all meaning. We were you, I said. We are what you will become. We have been sailing for, I do not know how long. Long enough to forget what we were searching for. Long enough to forget what it feels like to care that we have forgotten. You are speaking madness. Yes, I agreed. We are mad, but not in the way you understand madness. We are not raving or violent or corrupted. We are simply absent. The human parts have eroded away. What remains is function without feeling, purpose without passion. We are a ship that can no longer remember why ships matter. The other me, the me that was still whole, did not respond immediately. I imagined him on his bridge, consulting with his officers, trying to determine if this was a trick or a threat or some form of warp corruption. I knew what he would decide, because I remembered being him. He would treat this as a potential danger. He would maintain distance. He would prepare to defend his ship and his crew from whatever unknown horror we represented. If what you say is true, he said finally, then what do you want? Why have you made contact? That was a good question. Why had I? What did I hope to accomplish? I tried to remember the emotion of warning, of wanting to save someone from a fate you had suffered. I could recall that such an emotion existed. I could not access it, but I could simulate it. I could execute the behaviors that emotion would have prompted. Turn back, I said. Abort your mission. Return to real space now, while you still remember what return means. That is impossible. I have my orders. Your orders will destroy you, not quickly, not through corruption or violence, but slowly, inevitably, until what remains of you is this, a shell executing routines while the substance of you leaks away into the warp. You are attempting to sow fear and discord. This is a standard chaos tactic. I will not be swayed. I almost laughed. It would have been funny, if I could still access humor. He thought I was trying to corrupt him. He thought this was temptation, or psychological warfare, or some scheme to turn him from the Emperor's light. He could not conceive that I was simply telling him the truth. Scan us, I said. Use your psychers. Use your sensors. Search for any trace of chaos taint. You will find nothing. Because you are hiding it. Because it is not there. We are not corrupted. We are eroded. There is a difference. Silence again, longer this time. I waited because I had infinite patience now. Patience was all I had. If I believed you, the other me said finally, what would you have me do? I have a mission. I have duty. I have a crew depending on me to see them safely to our destination. Would you have me abandon all of that because of a ghost story? Yes, I said simply. That is not acceptable. Then sail on, I said. Complete your mission. And when the chronometers begin to disagree, when your crew begins to hollow, when you find yourself unable to feel anything except the cool, distant interest of observing your own decay, remember this conversation. Remember that you had a choice. We always have a choice, Captain. That is what separates us from servitors. No, I said. We had a choice, once. But choices require caring about outcomes, and we no longer care. We simply execute the programming of what we used to be. You still have time. Use it. I terminated the connection. We translated away, leaving the other, Geestelijke Vrijheid alone in that empty space. I did not know if we had actually encountered a younger version of ourselves. Some kind of temporal anomaly, a fold in causality, or if the warp had simply generated a perfect simulation to torment us with memories of what we had lost. It did not matter. Either way, the message had been delivered. And either way, it would be ignored. Because I remembered being that captain. I remembered the certainty that duty mattered more than fear, that the Emperor's work must be done regardless of personal cost. I had chosen to sail on, and I would sail forever. The end came not with finality but with recognition. We translated one last time, or perhaps not the last time, perhaps there would be infinite more translations, perhaps we had already translated infinite times, and this was just another iteration in an endless sequence, and emerged into a warp current that looked like a sea. Not metaphorically. The warp site portals showed water, actual water, extending in all directions, following fluid dynamics, complete with waves and foam and the suggestion of depth beneath the surface. It was impossible, of course. Water cannot exist in the void. But the warp does not care about possibility. It cares about symbols and stories, and the accumulated weight of human imagination. And sailors fear the sea. I stood at my command throne and looked at the impossible ocean, and I understood. The warp had recognized what we were. The Flying Dutchman, the ghost ship, the eternal voyager. And it had given us what all such stories require: a sea to sail upon forever. Navigator, I said, set course for any direction. It does not matter which. Aye, Captain. The ship moved forward. Her engines hummed. Her prow cut through water that could not exist, generating wake that followed no known physics. We sailed the warp sea, and I knew, with the kind of knowledge that requires no verification, that simply is, that we would sail it forever. This was not punishment. The warp does not punish. It simply recognizes patterns and reinforces them. We had become a pattern, the pattern of endless voyage, of searching without finding, of purpose without completion. And the warp, in its terrible efficiency, had crystallized that pattern into eternal form. We would encounter other ships. We would sometimes destroy them, not from malice but from simple presence. We would spread our story through the cosmos, becoming the legend that explained the unexplainable. We would sail forever, crewed by things that remembered being human but could no longer quite manage it. I thought about the question I had asked at the beginning of this testimony. What is a sailor who has forgotten what harbor feels like? I had searched for the answer through research, through observation, through clinical analysis of my own decay. And now I understood. A sailor who has forgotten what harbor feels like is simply a sailor. Nothing more, nothing less. The destination does not define the voyage. The feeling does not define the function. Remove everything that makes sailing meaningful, and what remains is still a ship moving through water, a crew executing their duties, a captain giving orders. The form persists after the substance fades. We sail because that is what ships do. We search because that is what the lost do. And we continue because we have forgotten that continuing was supposed to serve a purpose beyond itself. I am Captain Hendrick van der Decken of the Geestelijke Vrijheid. I was the keeper of a ship that could not sink. Now I navigate seas that do not exist, and I can no longer remember what land felt like beneath my feet. I have documented our transformation from human to hollow, from ship to symbol, from servants of the Imperium to wandering echoes of ourselves. This testimony will never be heard, but it exists, recorded in our data banks, transmitted into the void on frequencies that reach no one, preserved for no audience except ourselves and the uncaring cosmos. We were sailors who forgot what harbor felt like, and we sail forever. The sea stretches before us, impossible and infinite. The ship moves forward, because that is what ships do. My crew execute their duties with mechanical precision, because they have forgotten that there was supposed to be joy in service, or fear in danger, or hope in the journey. I give the orders. They obey. We sail. That is all we are now. All we will ever be. A ship without destination, a crew without feeling, a captain without the capacity to care that caring has been lost. We are the Flying Dutchman, and we sail forever, into the dark, into the impossible, into the endless space between stars where stories become real, and the weight of narrative crushes all that it touches. I was a man once. I am a function now. And that will have to be enough. Because I have forgotten what it means for something to be insufficient. Because I have forgotten what it means to want more. Because I have forgotten what it means to forget. We sail, forever. The end that is not an ending. The completion that is merely continuation. The final answer to the question I no longer remember caring about. This is what we are. This is what we have become. This is what will remain long after the Imperium falls and the stars burn out, and the universe collapses back into the probability that birthed it. A ship. Sailing. Forever.